Hey everybody, welcome to Frannie Square and to part 4 of the Make It Your Own Design series where we're going to be writing our pattern. Okay, so if you've been following along in the Make It Your Own Design series, in episode 1 we talked about the different steps involved in creating your own crochet project. In episode 2, we started filling out our project planning worksheet. We chose our materials, we chose our stitch, we chose our edging, any motifs we were going to use, and we did that based on the project we were making and the requirements that we wanted for our project. In episode 3, we talked all about swatching and we completed our swatches. So now we're up to episode 4. We have all of that completed and we're going to write our pattern for our very first project. This is very exciting. At the end of this, you will have created a project and written a pattern for it. Now, if you haven't watched the previous episodes, I'm going to put a link right here to the playlist. Go take a look and then follow along and join us when you're ready. Okay, so today what we're going to talk about is writing the pattern. So the basic steps in writing a pattern are, number 1, making your final calculations so you know how many stitches and rows and those sorts of things that you're going to want for your pattern. Now we did a very simple basic rectangular design to start because it's the easiest thing to do these calculations on, and I think it's the best way to learn. So as you know, my project was a placemat and I actually already put up a tutorial for it. And for me, doing that tutorial was part of the first step, writing your preliminary pattern. And I'll explain that. The very first step I do is I make the calculations to just figure out how many stitches across I want, how many rows down and for this pattern in particular, for the body of the placemat. And the edging I already have figured out from my swatching that I'm going to do these 3 rows. I don't need to figure out how many stitches or how many rows. I already know how many rows, and the stitches are going to be based on the body of the placemat because it's just going to go around the body. So the first thing that I wanted to do was sit down with my swatch and do a calculation as to how many stitches and rows I was going to need. After that, I sit down and I pretend I'm giving a tutorial. In this case, I didn't pretend. I did it right on camera so that we would have it. And while I'm doing the tutorial, I'm writing my pattern. So you can sit down, pretend you're teaching somebody your pattern. And as you start to make your pattern, write down exactly what you're doing. So for example, I started with the chain. Now, I will show you my calculation, but I came up with I needed 40 stitches across to get the size I wanted in this placemat. So I knew that I don't start my first stitch right on the first chain. I needed a few extra chains. So I chained an extra 3, knowing that I wanted it as high as a double crochet, and I started from there. So I started out with chain 43. I did it, wrote it down. Then I knew I wanted to alternate. Double crochet, single crochet, double crochet. So I wrote that down as I did it. And that's basically what you're going to do. You're going to write down what you do to create your project. Now, I'm going to say this again, as I've said before. It is very rare that I sit down and say, okay, I'm going to need 40 stitches across, 24 rows down. I do it and everything works out perfectly. Things come up. Things that you didn't think of come up and you realize, oh, I didn't think of that. Okay, I need to change something here. And you change it. That's why you do this whole preliminary process. So don't be discouraged. This is your chance to really fine-tune your pattern. And nothing has to be written in stone. Everything is changeable. Everything is froggable. So don't worry about it and don't think, oh, I'm not good at this because it's not turning out exactly the way I planned. Like I said, there are so many times that I change my pattern until I get it to be what I want it to be. After sitting down and writing your preliminary pattern, it's great to have somebody who crochets go through and try to make the project based on your instructions. Then they can tell you, oh, I didn't understand this, or this didn't work, or that didn't make sense, and you can make changes to it. If you don't have somebody else who can do that for you, you can go through your pattern and make your project exactly as you have it written. That can be tough because you know what you're going for in your head, but you have to kind of put that out of your mind and just follow step by step this preliminary pattern that you've written and see if it works. Okay, so let's go over to the table and we'll talk about the first step, making our calculations based on our swatch to figure out how many stitches and how many rows we need in this rectangular project. Okay, so let's talk figuring out how to write your preliminary pattern. So this was my original drawing for my placemat. I had a plan to have the body of my placemat and then some sort of edging that was going to be, my total placemat was going to be 18 inches by 13 inches, and I made my edging 2 inches on each side. After doing my swatch, my second swatch, because I didn't like my first swatch, I tried to make about a 6 by 6 swatch for the body of the piece. And this is going to be the stitch that I'm going to use for my placemat, which is just an alternating double crochet, single crochet stitch. So very rarely does your swatch come out to be exactly the size that you want. So I just want to make sure what size I have here. And it looks like going across, I'm at about 5.5 inches or so. About 5 3/4 inches down. So rows wise about 5 3/4 inches, and across it came out to about 5.5 inches, just the body piece. Now the reason I'm being more exact for this part is because I'm actually writing the pattern. When I'm estimating how much yarn I need, I'm not so exact, but when I go to write my preliminary pattern, I try to be as exact as possible. Okay, so let's look at the math. Oh, and the other thing I decided, instead of a 2-inch border, I decided to go with just the 3 rows, which is about a 1-inch border. You can see there. So that changed my pattern a little bit because I'll need my body to be a bigger piece since my edging is going to be a smaller piece. So the first thing I do is my calculations. So my original drawing had a 2-inch border, but I'm changing that to a 1-inch border. And it's going to be 3 rounds because we're going to have the 3 colors. So that's 3 rounds of the border. My placemat I want to be 18 inches long, and 2 inches of that, 1 inch on each side, is going to be the border. So the body piece is going to be 16 inches long. Now the height I want to be 13 inches, and again the top border and the bottom border will be 1 inch each, which adds up to 2 inches, which will leave me 11 inches for the body. So the body of my placemat I want to be 16 by 11. Okay, so for the length, I did 14 stitches across, and I know that the 14 stitches added up to 5.5 inches. So if I want to know how many stitches per inch, I just take those 14 stitches and I divide by the 5.5 inches, and I had 2.5 stitches per inch of my body piece. Now I want 16 inches, so I take that 2.5 stitches per inch and I multiply it by 16 to give me 40 stitches. So I'm going to need 40 stitches to achieve the length of the body that I want. Okay, now for the height, we did something similar. I did 13 rows in the body, and I know that 13 rows equaled 5 3/4 inches. So that means I have 2.2 rows per inch. I'll just put inch here, okay? This is per inch also. So I have 2.2 rows per inch. So I want 11 inches. So I'm going to have to multiply this 2.2, because that's only for 1 inch. I have to multiply it by 11, and that gives me 24 rows that I'm going to want. Now, it actually gave me 24.2 rows, so I rounded it down. So you're not going to get exact numbers, but you can just round whichever direction you want, up or down. So that's the basic math I use to figure out how many stitches and rows I'm going to need in the body of this placemat. So I came up with 40 stitches across and 24 rows. Now I suggest when you're writing your pattern that you actually go through and write it as you crochet. So crochet your piece, you're doing a preliminary pattern, and as you crochet it, write down what you're doing. That's the easiest way to do it. So in a pattern, there are things that you want to make sure you include. It's basically like a recipe for how to make your project. The first thing, of course, is the ingredients or the materials. So my materials, I used Ice Yarn's Natural Chunky Yarn, and I put some information about it. It's 100% cotton, it's a 5-weight yarn. The skeins come in 200 grams, 140 meters. I'm going to need a main color, which I used the light salmon, 1 skein. Color A, mint green, 1 skein, and color B, lilac, 1 skein. This way people can replace this if they want. They just look at this yarn, see the attributes, and then they can see what kind of yarn they'd like to replace it with, or they can get the exact same yarn. I used a 6mm crochet hook, and I put or the size to obtain gauge, because we're going to give a gauge in our pattern, a pair of scissors, and a yarn needle. The next thing you want to have is a legend. To help you in writing your pattern and in writing your legend or key, I will have a link in the description below to the Craft Yarn Council's master list of crochet terms and abbreviations. Also, it can be very helpful to look at patterns to see how other designers write their patterns. It may give you ideas of how to write the instructions in your pattern. Also, don't forget small details like turning your work or fastening off. Everything you do should be written into your pattern. So all this tells the person is when you see these abbreviations, what do they mean? And you'll just, for every single abbreviation you use in your pattern, make sure that it's here in your legend. So I'm sure you are familiar with these. CH equals chain, SC equals single crochet, DC double crochet, ST stitch, and SLST slip stitch. Okay, then in sizing, I give the finished measurement of the project that I'm making. Now, if it's a piece of clothing, there's going to be more measurements. You'll have a chest measurement, you'll have a waist measurement, things of that sort. But for this little rectangular placemat, I just gave the finished measurement, which is 18 inches by 13 inches. Then you have a section called notes, where you want to put any notes because you want to make your pattern as understandable as possible. So just pretend that you're doing a tutorial on your pattern. What do you want the person to know? So in this case, I wanted to talk about the first round of edging, because what happens when you do the first round of edging is, as I go across here, I have a stitch that I just stick each stitch into. But when I go down the side, I don't have stitches, it's just rows. So I wanted to tell the person that's making this pattern, when working the first round of edging, you will not have stitches along the sides of your placemats. Do your best to evenly space your stitches. I usually try to get a stitch per row of crocheted body piece. After round 1 of the edging is complete, you will have stitches to follow for your remaining 2 rounds. So I just wanted them to know that as they go down the sides of their placemat, they're going to have to just, the best they can, space their stitches as evenly as possible. Okay, so that was really the only note I had for this. Now the next piece, the gauge. The reason we put the gauge is because when I crochet with a 6mm hook, and when somebody else crochets with a 6mm hook, because of our tension and various things, our crocheting is not necessarily consistent size-wise. So by giving the gauge, I'm saying if you do 14 stitches of the body pattern and 13 rows of it, you should come up with a swatch that is 6 inches by 6 inches. Now I will adjust this gauge after I'm done, because as you saw when I measured my swatch, it wasn't exactly 6 by 6. So I may take a 4 by 4 piece of this and count the rows and the number of stitches. You want to make sure your gauge is accurate, because if the person uses your 6mm hook, does this and comes out with an 8 by 8 swatch, they say to themselves, wow, I'm crocheting way bigger than this person did. I'm going to move my hook down a size or two to try to get these 14 stitches and 13 rows to equal 6 by 6. So you want to include a gauge. Now, in a placemat or a blanket, if you're a little bit off, it typically doesn't matter unless you've bought a kit with a certain amount of yarn and you're going to run out of yarn. If your placemat's a little bit bigger or your blanket's a little bit smaller, not a big deal. But in a piece of clothing, I highly, 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 I don't know if I can say that enough times, recommend that you follow gauges when you're following a pattern, and you definitely have to put a gauge in when you're writing the pattern. Okay, so now we get to the pattern. So I'm going to start for this with writing the pattern for the body, this center. Let me use my swatch, you'll see that better. For the body piece. And then afterwards, I'll write the pattern for the edging, okay? So we said for the body piece, I need 40 stitches across. But as we know, when we chain, we don't start right with that first chain as a stitch. So I started with 43. Then from there, I simply start making my piece, and I write down everything I do. So I double crocheted into the 4th chain from the hook, and then I started my single crochet, then I double crocheted, single crocheted, repeated that 19 times to the end of the row and turned. So as I did it, I just wrote it down. And that's what I did for the entire placemat. I wrote down exactly what I did, trying to be as clear as possible. And anytime I had a footnote, for example, down here, I put corner stitch with a little asterisk. I want to tell them what that corner stitch is. So then at the bottom here, I have an asterisk, and it says corner stitch is the second of 3 single crochets used to make the corner in round 1. Okay, so that's just defining what that corner stitch is. So basically what you'll do then is you write your entire pattern like that, making sure you have all of those sections. And then what I like to do is I like to have a friend or somebody who knows how to crochet follow my pattern and see where they came up with problems. Because if I do it, I already know what I'm talking about, so that's difficult. I need somebody to look at it who hasn't looked at this pattern at all, and I want to know, will they be able to follow this pattern and come out with the end product that I'm trying to get them to make. So once somebody else or you have gone through your pattern and made all the changes that are needed to make your pattern work, you want to put on the finishing touches. So you want to put on a cover sheet which shows a picture of the finished project. You want to add your name as the designer. You want to maybe put an introduction in and talk about what this project is about and what it's used for. Then you may want to add some pictures throughout the pattern, just showing the progress of each of the steps. You may want to add some charts. If you have a special stitch, you can add a special stitch section toward the top where you describe how to do that special stitch. That way you can just name it and put that into your pattern rather than writing out all the steps for the special stitch each time it's used. So those are the basic steps of designing your own project and writing your own pattern. I hope you found this helpful. If you have any questions at all, please list them in the comments below or send me an email to my email address at franniesquare@gmail.com. I'm so excited that you've taken this design journey with me, and going forward, we're going to add more and more skills and do more and more complicated projects. I'd love to know what you think of this series and what you'd like to learn during this series so I can make sure I'm responding to your needs. As always, thank you so much for joining me. I truly appreciate it. Remember to make it your own, and I'll see you soon.